Hello, everyone. Um, we're just going to wait until everyone is able to come in. As you're coming in, can you please let us know where you're tuning in from? That'd be really awesome. You might find a neighbor in the chat. So just tell us where you're coming in from as you come into the webinar. We have North Carolina as our first person here. Southington, New Jersey, Ohio, more folks from Connecticut and Maryland. Good to see people from outside of Connecticut. New York City as well. We're just gonna go ahead and get started then as people slowly come in. Good evening. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm delighted to host tonight's program. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting this and our other virtual programs. Now let me introduce our guests. Tonight we are welcoming H.W. Brands for a presentation about his new book, The Last Campaign, Sherman, Geronimo, and the War for America. H.W. Brands taught at Texas A&M University for 16 years before joining the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin, where he is the Dixon Allen Anderson Centennial Professor of History. His books include Traitor to His Class, Andrew Jackson, The Age of Gold, The First American, and TR, the latter two of which were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. So we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. And HW will be getting to questions at the end of his presentation. Please note that you can click on live transcript at the bottom center of the screen to see live auto captioning of this event. Now that's all from me. Please sit back and enjoy, and over to you, HW.
Thank you, Omar, for that kind introduction, and thank you to Mark Twain House for hosting the event this evening. I'm going to explain why I wrote this book, what I hope to accomplish in the book. I'm not going to give away the endings for some of them, don't want to spoil the surprise, but I'm going to speak in lieu of a preface. Years ago, I decided that I was going to stop writing prefaces because as a reader, I was always annoyed by the stuff that you have to trip over to get to page one to where the story starts. So I stopped writing prefaces, but I'm going to explain a little bit since you took the time to tune in this evening. I think of history, I've been teaching history a long time. I've been thinking about history for a long time. And I have concluded, at least for me, that there are two sort of instructive ways to think about history. I point these out to my students to decide whether you find them instructive or not. But I think that history takes place at two levels. There is big history. This is the history of, it's the history of public life. It's the history of war and peace. It's the history of industrial revolutions. It's the history of the great inventions, the moonshots, the stuff that, well, makes it into the headlines of the newspapers, that makes it into the history books 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years later. So this is big history, is the stuff that impacts everybody alive at that time, or at least a lot of people alive at that time. It's the part of history we all share at any given time. It's public history, but public in a very broad sense, not just public with government, but just sort of public. It's out there and it affects us all. That's big history. Little history, on the other hand, is the history of private life. It's the history of what did you do this morning? My father, now deceased, was for many years my model reader. And every writer, every author, I think, needs to have a model reader, the person that you're trying to figure out what my readers know, what are they expecting. Writing is an act of communication. The first thing you need to know is, what is that person at the other end of the communication chain? What are they thinking? What are they looking for? And my father was a model reader. I'm going to guess that my father was to me what many of you are to this evening. He was, I can't tell if any of you are university students. I teach at the University of Texas, so I think you're probably a different audience than my students. And if you are the audience that I imagine, now if we were in person, I could get an even better guess at this, but knowing the kind of audiences that the Twain House and other places like this attract, I'm going to guess that most of you are not history professionals. You're probably not academic historians. Few, if any of you, are historians in the sense of writing history yourself. But obviously, you're all interested enough in history that you spent an hour out of your evening, or wherever you are at the time of day, to listen to something about history. So my father was very much this way. He was not a specialist in history. In fact, he was a mechanical engineer. He was an engineer by training, and he was a businessman by his lifelong work. He always was interested in the way the world worked, the way things were put together. He had that, I guess he had a kind of an engineer's approach to things. He wanted to know how the pieces of life fit together. He was an avid reader in his working life while he was still working, before he retired. He was an avid reader of the Wall Street Journal, a couple of local newspapers in Portland, Oregon, where I grew up, Fortune magazine, Forbes, Hardware Age, the things that would enhance his business, that would improve the business that he owned and operated. After he retired, however, he still read the Wall Street Journal, but he didn't read the other magazines so closely. He read books more. But the books that he always read, almost always read, were nonfiction books, and they tended toward history because he liked a good story, but he also liked at the end of the book to feel that he knew more about the world as it actually was, rather than the world as it was imagined by, let's say, the novelist. So my dad was actually a great model reader for me, because that's who I was writing for. That's who I'm going to assume very many of you in the audience this evening are, or at least very much like. And I will tell you that my dad was a very candid reader. He read my books, and I know he did because we would have conversations about them. And he would say, well, Billy, as he called me, this was, I like this part of the book, kind of slowed down here. You could have done better there. So I appreciated this. And this is, I think, what every author needs. But my dad early on, somehow or other, he acquired a 7-volume biography of George Washington, the general and president, by Douglas Southall Freeman. And he always had it on the bookshelf in his study. And I can remember many times when I'd be in the study just chatting with him, and he would point up there and point at these 7 volumes on George Washington. And he would say, after reading those, I know what George Washington had for breakfast every day of his life. And I eventually got around to reading the books. And yeah, you probably do it. When you have that much space to devote to one person's life, you can get into that kind of detail. Well, that kind of detail is precisely what I'm talking about. I want to talk about little history. It's the history of individual lives. And your little history is different from my little history and everybody else's little history. Now, for some reason or other, maybe it's because I read that biography of George Washington when I was younger. Maybe I was just drawn to the same sort of things my father was drawn to. Is I have never been able to write history that doesn't kind of boil down to biography in some basic sense. My first whack at this enterprise, writing history, was a dissertation when I was a graduate student at the University of Texas. And most dissertations are pretty theoretical, and they tend to be engaged. They're not traditionally oriented. And I wanted to write about American foreign policy, but I also wanted to write about people. So I wound up writing a collective biography of the foreign policy makers of the Eisenhower administration. And from that point until now, I simply cannot write a book that doesn't focus on individuals. And this because, first of all, to me, it's the stories of individuals in history that draw me to history, that drew me to history in the first place. My grandfather, my father was my model reader, but my grandfather died before I started writing. But he was a sucker for traveling book salesmen. I didn't even know such things existed, but apparently they did when my grandfather was younger. And he would buy the complete works of Sir Walter Scott. Now, nobody should own the complete works of Walter Scott, but he also bought the complete works of Hubert Howe Bancroft. That's a name that might not be as familiar as Walter Scott to many of you, but it was much more pertinent to me because Hubert Bancroft was the great historian of the West, the American West, in the 19th century. And he wrote multi-volume histories of California, of Oregon, the Pacific Northwest. He went as far east as Texas, the fur trade, all of this stuff. And I remember reading these and just being drawn into them, not because they were polished works of history, but precisely because they were unpolished works of history. Bancroft would essentially find caches of letters and journals of fur traders and diaries kept by Argonauts heading out to the California gold fields. And he would reproduce them at length. And this was the part of the book that I liked best because I found that I was much more attracted to the actual figures in history. I wanted to hear what they had to say. I wanted to see the world as they saw it, not filtered through a historian. And so over the years, I have found myself writing biographies, I say in one form or another. There was a time when I was writing just a series of big biographies. And I had this idea that I would write the history of the United States in the form of biographies. And I eventually wrote 6 of them, starting with Benjamin Franklin and ending with Ronald Reagan. And so those are regular biographies. But everything else that I wrote, it focuses on some individuals. So I decided that I wanted to tell the story of the way what I cast in the subtitle of the book, of this book, I cast as the War for America. I wanted to see how that ended. And the War for America is this thing that I conceive to be the contest, the struggle, very often amounting to armed struggle, to violence, to war, to see who would control the resources of the territory that would become the United States of America. So not all of North America, not all of the Americas, but I'm really zeroing in on what's going to become the United States of America. But the War for America, the conflict, the contest begins long before there's any United States of America. And so I cast the book in this 10,000 year history of humans in North America. Now, humans have been in North America apparently much longer than 10,000 years, but it's a round number. And one of the things that I propose at the beginning of the book, and you will have your own thoughts on this, is that there has been a contest for who would control the resources of North America almost from the beginning. And if you go far enough back in prehistory, we can't document this, but as far as we know, there was always jostling for control of this hunting ground or that fishing spot or these resources or this place where the camas roots grow best. And we know from what we can gather from anthropology and also from early history that before the Europeans arrived in North America, the different Indian nations, the indigenous peoples, they were jockeying for position and they were engaged in wars one against the other. So this is what I conceive as the War for America. It's this, in round numbers, it's this 10,000 year contest to see who is going to control the land and the other resources of this piece of earth, this patch of ground that is going to become the United States of America. And I focus on the final 25 years of this, the last campaign, as I call the book. And this is where the United States, at the end of the Civil War and the way it turned out demonstrated that the United States as a republic is not going to break into 2 pieces or more pieces. This resolves the contest for the East. the part of America that is east of the Mississippi River and spilling over a little bit in the southwest to Texas. But in 1865, we know that there's going to be one government in control of the eastern half of the continent. The question is, what's going to happen in the western half of the continent? And so the battleground, so to speak, and it's more than just so to speak, the stage setting for my story is the western United States, essentially west of the Mississippi River, because by this time, the Indian question, as it was often conceived, the Indian question was settled in the East. There were no longer any Indian nations. There were no longer any indigenous peoples that were living under their own governments east of the Mississippi River. There still was this question. And so that part of the contest, who is going to control, who's going to set the rules, who's going to make the laws for that half of the United States has been settled. And again, settled vis-a-vis the Union and the Confederacy. So now the question shifts to the western half of the continent. Who is going to make the laws? Who's going to control the resources? And how is this going to turn out? So in 1865, this last campaign begins. This is the big history question that I propose to deal with, I attempt to answer. But given my predilections, I need to find a couple of individuals to focus my story on, and I choose two. They're the Sherman and Geronimo of the subtitle. Sherman, William Sherman, was the Civil War general. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, he was the second most famous soldier in America, the second most distinguished soldier in America. We could make a partial exception for Robert E. Lee, but Lee was on the losing side. Sherman was on the winning side, outranked in the public mind only by Ulysses Grant. And Ulysses Grant in 1865 is and will remain the general-in-chief of the US Army. So he has command of all the Army forces, and he holds that job until he becomes president of the United States in 1869, and then he's commander-in-chief. And Sherman in 1865 receives command of the Army of the West. So from in this region west of the Mississippi River, this is Sherman's responsibility. And he takes command of this final campaign. Now, I can call it the last campaign because I know how it turned out. I should point out that it was pretty clear to most Americans at the time that that's the way it was going to turn out, that this was really sort of the mopping up operation against the Indians. However, it was an open question as to how long it would take, on what terms it would end, who would be left standing when it did end. So this is Sherman's responsibility. When Grant becomes president of the United States, Sherman becomes general-in-chief of the US Army. So he has more responsibility than that. In fact, much of his time was spent trying to deal with Reconstruction. When he became president of the when he became commander of the Army was an occupation of most of the former Confederate South. So he had other things to deal with, but I focus on his attention to the West. So Sherman is my protagonist, or in this context, one of my two antagonists. Geronimo was the other. Now, Geronimo was never in command of any force at all comparable to what Sherman had at his command. But Geronimo captures an essential part of this story because, well, in part because he's the last one to surrender, but also because he exemplifies the central question here. It's a question that, in fact, arises in any war, and that is, when does the loser acknowledge defeat? It's sometimes tempting to think, if you don't think it through too closely, that it's the winners in war, sort of who determines when wars end. No, that's not it at all. Because if the losers continue to fight, then the war's not over yet. Now, occasionally, the losers are so destroyed that there are none left to resist at all, but no sizable war has ever ended that way. So it's always a matter of, when do the people on the losing side decide that the war is no longer worth fighting, that they cannot accomplish anything positive by maintaining the struggle? And I pose this as a question that all of us confront in one form or another, usually not in the context of war, but in the context of something going wrong, something that we wanted to achieve, and we discovered, I'm just not going to be able to do it. And there's a certain romance around the person who fights to the bitter end and never gives up. But in real life, that's not the way it works. And in fact, as we'll see, it's one thing if you do it simply for yourself, but the people that we're talking about were responsible for other lives and other individuals. And so you have to make this decision. And this will seem like a very trivial kind of example, but my first career goal when I was a kid is I wanted to be a major league baseball player. I wanted to play center field for the San Francisco Giants. This because I grew up rooting for the San Francisco Giants. The Giants were the closest major league team to Portland, where I grew up. At that time, there's no team in Seattle yet. And Willie Mays was my sports hero. And I thought, I want to be like that. And I played baseball for a while, but it didn't take me too long to realize that I just didn't have it in me to be a major league baseball player. Now, I suppose I could have stuck it out longer than I did, but it wouldn't have ended any differently. So I decided to go off and do something else. And I'm happy with the way things turned out. But I don't know, it still would have been cool to play Major League Baseball. But anyway, my point is that we all have to make this decision at some level or another. In some cases, it can be if you're in a relationship, maybe a marriage that's going badly. How long do you fight to hold the relationship together? And then when do you finally say enough is enough? We have to take a new course. So this is the question that Geronimo had to answer, because by the time he's confronting Sherman, it's pretty clear that the Apaches of Arizona and the neighboring regions spilling over into Mexico, they're probably not going to win this war for America. And there are a variety of reasons for this, and I go into them in the book, and I'll be happy to talk about them this evening. But the basic reason is that the Apaches and all the other indigenous peoples who are still resisting American control, the rule of American law, they're enormously outnumbered by citizens of the United States, by the people of the United States. And the disparity is growing. In 1865, when my story really begins, there are somewhat more than 30 million people living in the United States. And there are less than 500,000 Indians, Native Americans. So those numbers, they just don't allow anything except a victory by the United States side. And I should add that the numbers of people living in the United States is growing rapidly. By the end of my story, in the late 1880s, that number is up to 65 million. And the number of Native Americans, it's gone down even more. So anybody who looked at these demographic figures would realize there's no way that the Indians are going to hold on. But wait a minute, hold on to what? Well, they're not going to hold on to all of their land, that's for sure. But that really wasn't the question, because the control of the territory of the Western United States by different tribes had been shifting forever and ever. And so during much of this time, for example, the Comanches had invaded Texas, and they were driving the Apaches out, they were driving various other tribes out. And that was just kind of the way the world worked. So the question was, how is this going to turn out, and on what terms? So I focus on Geronimo because he's the one who answers this question. And the way the question actually arises for leaders of the Indian nations is, do you resist white expansion, or do you assimilate? Do you accept the terms of a treaty? Do you go on to a reservation? Do you give up your land, some of your land? They didn't give up all their land. Do you give up some of your land? But the bigger thing is, and this is where the tug really comes. Do you give up your traditional way of life? Because that's what it amounts to. When Geronimo surrendered, actually he surrendered 3 times. And the first 2 times, he said, okay, enough of this fighting. and it's time to come on to the reservation. And he would get on the reservation, and he just decided he didn't like being hemmed in like that. He didn't like living on the dole of the US government. And so he would break out again. And he would go on another campaign, typically into Mexico, and US troops would follow him, and off they would go. And he came onto a reservation, went off again, came onto a reservation, went off again. And finally, the third time when he surrendered, then this time it was done. And at that point, that's where I say that the last campaign has ended, the war for America is over. So this is the story that I tell. And one of the things that emerges in the story is that it was a lot more complicated than it is usually presented as being, because it was not simply a case of the white folks against the Indians. In fact, it was some of the white folks against some of the Indians, but it was also some of the Indians who split with other Indians and essentially sided with the white folks. And it's not going to spoil my story to explain that when Geronimo finally surrendered, he did not surrender. Well, I should say he wasn't tracked down. He wasn't defeated by US troops. He was tracked down and he was brought in by other Apaches who had concluded before Geronimo did that this resistance, it's long outlasted its usefulness. And furthermore, they looked on Geronimo as, in their charitable moments, a pain in the neck at this point, but worse than that, when they weren't feeling so charitable. I mean, he was a relatively old man, and so they would tolerate certain things from him. But it wasn't as though Geronimo was a hero to all the Apaches, because Geronimo, by insisting on breaking off the reservation and taking people with him. So here I'll digress to say that I chose Sherman and Geronimo in part because they both have very distinctive and compelling voices. I'm a historian, I'm not a novelist, so I don't get to make up dialogue. I don't get to imagine what's going on in the heads of my characters. I have to get it from their own mouths or from their own pens or something like that. If they didn't write it, if they didn't say it and somebody else wrote it down, I don't get to say it. I don't get to put the words in your mouths. One of the things that's appealing about Sherman is that he wrote a lot. He wrote lots of orders when he was commanding forces in the army. He wrote a memoir, which is a very compelling story. And so I'm able to tell that part of the story through Sherman's words in many cases, through Sherman's eyes in many cases. And this gets back at what I said drew me to history in the first place, that I liked the eyewitness accounts, the participant accounts. And now that I'm a historian, I'm sort of much more willing to be persuaded by what somebody who was there actually says about something or other than what a historian says about it. Now, in the history profession, we distinguish between primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are typically written documents of one form or another that were produced by individuals who were there, either actors or eyewitnesses. They're mostly contemporary to the story that's being told. Secondary sources, these are the equivalent of hearsay in a courtroom. And from any of the courtroom dramas that you've seen, usually hearsay evidence is inadmissible. You know, somebody told me that such and such. That's what the secondary source is. That's what a historian writing about this something says. And this is why I try to get to my individuals as much as possible. And Geronimo was one of the few leaders of indigenous peoples, one of the few war leaders who wrote a memoir. Now, technically, he dictated it and it was translated and all this stuff, but still, these are his words. And so I'm able to show what his world looked like to him, why he made the decisions he made. Now, anybody who hears anybody testify about what they do has to weigh the testimony and perhaps apply a few grains of salt to it. So, I mean, we do this in regular life all the time, and historians just make a habit of it. And so to triangulate this, I try to find other people who were there and who had their own stories to tell. So in the case of Geronimo, there was a young man, he was actually hardly more than a boy when the story takes place. His name was Jason Betsinez, and he was a cousin of Geronimo. And he's coming of age during a couple of Geronimo's campaigns off the reservation. And he makes it very clear that when Geronimo left the reservation, it wasn't just Geronimo. Geronimo was the leader of a band of Apaches. The Apache tribe was divided into several bands. And so when Geronimo left, then his band would leave with him, often reluctantly, because, oh my gosh, we're going to go on this wild goose chase again. We are going to be shot at in some cases. We're probably going to go hungry. We'll be cold. It's going to be a difficult time. And it's probably not going to end any differently than the last time around. So Jason Betsinez is this, he's the person who observes Geronimo from a respectful, often adoring a distance early on, because he's the much younger Apache coming of age, and he's finally allowed to take part in some of the battles. But he also, and one of the reasons that he's a useful witness for me, is that he was very close to his mother. And his mother comes along in all of this. And here I have to point out that when soldiers in the Blue Coats, when US Army troops met Indian warriors, it was very often a toss-up as to who was going to win. Sometimes the numbers weren't that different. Sometimes the armaments weren't that different. There were occasions when Indians were better armed than the soldiers that they were fighting against. They had access to arms dealers who would pay whatever, I mean, they would sell whatever the Indians had money to buy. But the vulnerability of the Indians was the fact that they always had to allow for the existence, the safety, the danger to their women and children. And this is something that rarely occurred to the soldiers, because the soldiers were in most cases far away from home and they could just go fight. And when they went into battle, they knew, okay, the danger is to me, but the danger is not to my wife back in Ohio or my kids who are hundreds of miles away. There were some exceptions to this. There were some soldiers who had families in the forts, but there was this asymmetry in the risk value. But it also meant that the existence of the dependents and the dependency of the dependents on leaders like Geronimo and leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and Joseph of the Nez Perce and Captain Jack of the Modocs and various other Indians. These were the ones, it was concern for the welfare of these individuals that ultimately, in almost every case, made the final decision for Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and Joseph, and finally Geronimo, because my women are starving, my kids don't have moccasins on their feet, and we're going to die out here in the winter. And so we have to come into the reservation. And that's really why the war for America ended the way it did. One last thing is, harks back to something that I said earlier, and having to do with the imbalance in numbers. One of the things that William Sherman did, one of the things that Ulysses Grant did as president of the United States, was time and again, they would extend invitations to leaders, Red Cloud, Lakota chief, to come to Washington, to come to the East, and invitations to people like Joseph of the Nez Perce, and invitations to Sitting Bull, and invitations to Geronimo. Come east, come east. And it wasn't simply that they wanted to make nice and try to talk them into accepting the latest reservation. It was really a matter of, we want you to see what you're up against. So if you were Geronimo, now Geronimo actually never did accept one of these invitations except under duress, after he had surrendered and then been declared a prisoner of war. Geronimo in Arizona had no idea what he was up against ultimately. It was easy for him to think that his band of 60 might be confronting George Crook's regiment of 250 soldiers or something like that. But the millions and millions of people behind the soldiers, the ones who could keep furnishing provisions, the ones who could furnish additional soldiers. The underlying reason for the invitations to the chiefs to come east was, once you do come east, you will see that you don't have a chance. And you're just going to have to surrender your traditional way of life. You're going to have to acknowledge that the law of the United States, to put it another way, the US Constitution governs from sea to sea. And strikingly, when those chiefs that did accept the invitation and did travel east to a person, they came back and they told their folks back home, we got to give it up because there is no way we can deal with populations like this. So this is the story that I tell. There are complications to it. I said it was never a case that it was just bluecoats, US Army troops against Indians. It was always US Army troops and Indians against Indians, who were often against other Indians. I should add, actually, the reason that it finally boiled down to US Army troops against Indians and they didn't have any other allies was that for the previous 250 years, they did have allies. And so just to hark back to one war whose name is familiar, the French and Indian War. I remember when I was a kid in school, the French and Indian War, the French must have been fighting the Indians. Well, no, that's not why it was called the French and Indian War. It was called the French and Indian War because the American colonists and the British, their colonial overlords, the American colonists were part of the British Empire at this point, were fighting against French and Indians. The French had their Indian allies. And in this war, the British, the Americans, had their Indian allies. And this was true in pretty much every contest, every phase, every campaign of this war. And it goes back even farther into what I would generally call this war for America. There were alliances among Indian tribes against other Indian tribes. And it's a question that sometimes does come up. So why was it that when George Custer marched against Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and the Lakotas in the campaign that ended at the Battle of Little Bighorn, at least that phase of the campaign, why was it that Crow Indian scouts marched with Custer? Why was it that Indians would ally with the whites against Indians? And the answer is, well, the simple answer is that the Crows, they had more against the Lakotas than they did against the whites. And this makes sense because historically, the Crows and Lakotas had been enemies. And this gives rise to another aspect of this story that complicates the question, because it is often presumed, is often asserted that when the US Army troops and the American settlers moved into a region, they displaced Indian tribes from lands that they had held from time immemorial. And this was almost never the case. The tribes had moved around and they had gained control of this area by displacing somebody else. So a central part of my story, a focus of this last campaign, is the battle for the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, now in the state of South Dakota. And the Lakotas, that branch of the Sioux, they asserted that the Black Hills are sacred to us. And in some ways, I guess they were, but it's not as though they've been sacred to the Lakotas forever. In fact, the Lakotas seized the Black Hills from the Crows. And in fact, they did it in a climactic battle in 1776. So when people were talking about who owns this land, who controls this land, I actually try to avoid the use of the word owns the land, because to own something usually implies to have legal title to it. And a fundamental question in all of this is, who, if anybody, does have legal title to this land? If the concept of legal title did not occur to Indians the way it did to Americans living in the East, being the heirs of the common law tradition of England, because nobody held a title, nobody had a piece of paper that said, this is our territory. And the rule was, as the fight between the Lakotas and the Crows demonstrated, and the Comanches and the Apaches for control of Texas, all of this was, it basically, and this sounds like a harsh rule, but it's the rule that persisted until, again, the end of this war for America. And the rule was you take what you can and you hold it until you can't. And this had been the operating rule as far back as anybody can see, and it remained the operating rule until, essentially, the surrender of Geronimo. At that point, now all of a sudden it's clear that the US Constitution is in force. It had been claimed that the Constitution controlled all this, but as long as some Indian tribes were resisting American control by force, the Constitution was not in effect. And so now this is where we are. And finally, the Constitution, American law, does pertain to all this territory. Now, let's see if we have some questions. We got at least one question in the Q&A. And we'll go to here. So John has asked, to what degree did previous Native US decisions, such as Indian removal in Florida and the subsequent Trail of Tears, cause Geronimo or other Native American leaders to question what surrender to the US government would look like for their future? Speaking of Geronimo, I have no reason to believe that Geronimo ever heard of the Indian Removal Act. He was vaguely aware, but really only at second or third hand, that there was this policy of the US government trying to move Indian peoples out of the East and push them to the West. But Geronimo, until his capture, never got much farther east than Western New Mexico. He didn't get into Oklahoma or Indian Territory. And he wasn't reading newspapers or anything like this. And so he was aware that this stuff had gone on. And, but that didn't form any basis for his decision. Nor, I think, can I say that the policy, the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, the treatment of Indians in the East, I don't have any sense that even the most aware of the Indian leaders use that as a basis for making decisions, as in, we have to resist because they're going to steal our land anyway. No, it was really a matter of we're going to resist until we can't resist anymore. And none of them really trusted an American word, the word of the American government on anything. It was a matter you fight until you can't fight anymore. You hold on to your land until you can't, until it's taken from you. And indeed, this is what befell Geronimo. So one of the things that my telling the story as much as possible through the eyes of the individuals, through the words of the individuals who were there, demonstrates is that people have conflicting memories of the same events, or I guess I should say they have conflicting stories about what happens. So in the end, Geronimo surrenders to General Nelson Miles. And in Geronimo's version of the surrender, Miles, the US general, promised that he would be allowed to go onto the reservation and live there. He would not be arrested. He would not be treated as a prisoner of war. That's what Geronimo said that Miles had told him. Miles said, I told him no such thing. I said, this is an unconditional surrender. You're going to surrender to me. And if you don't accept this, then we're going to keep fighting. And eventually, you're going to have to. And so he capitulated. And he was then treated as a prisoner of war. He was sent to Florida, actually, to get him a long way away from any of the Apache reservations for the reason which seemed a good reason to Miles and to Sherman and the US government, was that every time Geronimo had agreed to go on a reservation before, he had broken out, and another campaign leading to the deaths of many people and great expense and great effort and all this stuff. So this time we're going to make sure he doesn't leave. We're going to keep him under guard. And we're going to take him a long way away from any place he's ever been where he won't have any friends. And Geronimo was kept in Florida for a while. He eventually was moved to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. But he remained a prisoner. He was allowed to go about his daily business, but he wasn't free to go back to Arizona. And so Geronimo claimed that he had been betrayed by Miles, and Miles said, no, he wasn't betrayed at all. I have no way of adjudicating between these two, so I don't even try. I said, these are what the two recollections are. And the fact of the matter was that Geronimo would have surrendered anyway, even if he hadn't been told that he wouldn't be sent away, because at this point he really didn't have any choices left. So, but this kind of gets at the larger question of, and I kind of came close to it, but didn't really answer it. So why didn't the various Indian tribes form an alliance against the whites? And the answer is, first of all, I did kind of hint at this, these historic enmities. At any given time, the tribes who lived next to each other often felt they were more threatened by their Native American neighbors than they were by these white folks coming in. And so, I mean, that sort of explains it. But then you could imagine, well, what if they had gotten together? It is true that there were a few occasions where there were attempts to put together alliances of the various tribes against the whites. And the most noted and the closest to success of any of these efforts was that of Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief. Now, here I'm going to stop for a minute and note that William Sherman's middle name was Tecumseh. And as a boy and a young man, he was often called Tecumseh by his middle name, and sometimes shortened to a nickname, Cump. And so people who had known Sherman from the time he was young referred to him as Cump, And this because Sherman's father was a great admirer of Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief who had tried to create this alliance, in alliance with the British against the white settlers, with the goal being to launch a campaign of such violence and even terror against settlers in the Ohio valleys to drive them back across the Appalachian Mountains. It didn't work. It didn't work because even with the alliance that he had, the Indian peoples were greatly outnumbered. But the fundamental problem was he could not bring everybody on board. And there were just as many Indians who said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with you, Shawnees. You've been beating up on us forever, so why should we ally with you? But the other answer, and the deeper answer, gets back to the fundamental question that I pose in all of this is, when things aren't going well, when do you finally say, we cannot resist usefully any longer? It's time to make a change. And in the case of the Trail of Tears here is mentioned, and the Indian Removal Act, even in the case of the Cherokees, when Andrew Jackson proposed and Congress approved the Indian Removal Act of 1830, it was made clear to the tribes of the old Southwest, what we think of as the Southeast, that they would have to, well, they had a choice. They could either abandon their idea that they would be independent of the government. If they wanted to stay in Georgia to focus on the Cherokees, they could stay in Georgia, that was fine. But they would have to answer to Georgia law. They would no longer be separate from Georgia law. And this had to do with states' rights, among other things, because the Constitution says that there shall be no territory created within an existing state. And there were some of the Cherokees, most of the Cherokees, who said, no, we're going to resist. We're not going to go along with this. But there was a substantial minority of the Cherokees who said, we're never going to get a better offer than this. We cannot hold on to this territory. We're gravely outnumbered. And so let's take the money and run. And so they did. This created a rift between the Cherokees, between two groups of the Cherokees that lasted for decades. So this was a principal reason that resistance to white expansion, white encroachment, always failed. Let's see. So Michael Wilkinson has a question. Outside of the Battle of Little Bighorn, was there another event that pushed public opinion to more fully support ending the Indian Wars? Here I'm going to point out that public opinion regarding the Indian Wars, what I call the last campaign, varied dramatically depending on what part of the United States you lived in. If you lived in the West and you were a white, not an Indian, you almost certainly were in favor of vigorous enforcement of the laws and vigorous efforts to make sure that the Indians went onto reservations and stayed there. You had suffered yourself or known of people who had suffered from Indian raids, and you were not in a position, you certainly weren't of a mind to say, maybe white people, maybe Europeans don't belong in North America at all. No, they were born in America, and their feeling was, well, they were operating on that principle that I extended earlier. You take what you can and you hold it till you can't. And if they could get more territory, they wanted it. And they also wanted protection from William Sherman's troops. If you lived in the East, however, it was quite possible to be more sympathetic to the Indians, in large part because it was sort of no personal concern of yours. And you could almost see a gradient in attitudes toward US policy and toward the Native Americans from East to West. So there were various people who criticized William Sherman and criticized the army and criticized the government for being too hard on the Indians. And they were always in the East. And the response of William Sherman was, well, it's easy for you to say this because you folks in Massachusetts, you solved your Indian problem long ago. But don't tell people in Colorado or people in Montana that they shouldn't be able to do what your grandfathers did in Massachusetts fighting King Philip. So there was no such thing as sort of public opinion singularly. There were all sorts of public opinions. However, it is true that there were certain Indian leaders who were quite adept at playing to public opinion. And the most famous and the most successful of these was young Joseph of the Nez Perce. He was called young Joseph because his father was also a Nez Perce chief, and his name was Joseph as well. But he's the chief Joseph that we know of. And he's the one of the heroic fighting retreat across the Rockies, across from Oregon into the Great Plains, with the idea maybe of heading even to Canada and safety in Canada, but only to surrender just short of the Canadian border. And it was seen as this very romantic battle for the lost cause. And this noble, the term noble savage was widely used and accepted. And it was actually something of a term of honor, the noble savage. Savage just meant somebody who wasn't made kind of weak by civilization. And Joseph recognized the value of cultivating reporters. Now, actually reporters, people who were there who following the campaigns, following the battles, they're an important source for me because they could see what was going on. Their job was to write it down, to report it. And Joseph understood how to talk to them in language that they would then convey to the East. And in some cases, Joseph didn't speak English, but he gave a number of speeches in which he's portrayed as this master of almost Shakespearean English. And his surrender speech, from which he concludes by saying, "From where the sun now sets, I will fight no more forever." Joseph was, I'm not exaggerating to say, he was America's favorite Indian ever. And this in his lifetime, in real time. And the newspapers of the day, they had sent the reporters out there, and they would record the campaign, almost blow by blow account, almost like the campaigns of the Civil War. I should add here that for journalists, for publishers of newspapers, they were kind of at a loss as to what we're going to report on. They got used to reporting on the campaigns of the Civil War, and they knew that wars and battles and campaigns sell newspapers because stuff happens every day. And you got to get the report in, and people want to read the papers. And so they had an incentive to cover the Indian Wars because this is something that's going on. But there was this serious split over what's supposed to go on here. And the reference here is the Battle of Little Bighorn. Well, this is the one where Custer, who is more heroic in death than he ever was actually in life, he was really very reckless and rash, he and all his men die. And it's easy then, since they all died, to say they must have died heroically. And furthermore, that this shows how treacherous these Indians are. Well, treachery, no, that really didn't come into practice here. The reason that Custer and his regiment were killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn was Custer was simply stupid in his leadership there. And Grant understood this. Grant was president at this point. And he had to deal with Custer. And this, again, shows one of the complications. Grant had his ideas of what Custer ought to do. Custer was a colonel. Grant was a general and commander-in-chief, but Grant could not give direct orders to Custer because Custer had fans and supporters in Congress who thought that those Black Hills ought to be part of the United States, and they ought to be open to gold seekers, gold prospectors, and all the people are going to make money off of that. So it's another complication. But when Grant heard that Custer had lost this horrible battle, he was outraged at Custer, not for getting himself killed, but for leading all these good men that Custer commanded to their deaths, needlessly, recklessly. Let's see what other questions we have. Was Geronimo aware of Tecumseh's story? I'm pretty sure he was not. I have no reason to think that anybody told it to him, and he certainly didn't read it from anyone. Possibly after his surrender, when he had time to talk to people on the reservation in Fort Sill. Let's see here. Why didn't the Indians at Southwest move to Mexico and take their chances with the Spanish Mexicans? In fact, this is where Geronimo went. Every time he left the reservation, he headed to Mexico. And sometimes he would have easier sailing there, but the Indians were actually treated even more harshly in Mexico and by the Mexican government than they were by the government of the United States. So Mexico had nothing like the reservations that were set aside for the Native American peoples in the United States. But for a while, Geronimo and other Apaches were able to use the fact of an international border to their own benefit. I should point out that when Geronimo was born, for the first half of Geronimo's life, there was no border between where he lived and Mexican territory. Arizona was part of Mexican territory. And he never really acknowledged that there was any real legitimacy to this border. And so he would wander across the border whenever he wanted and come back whenever he wanted. But he did discover early on that if the Americans were chasing him, if American soldiers were chasing him, and he went across the border into Mexico, then the American soldiers had to stop. And then if the Mexican soldiers were chasing him, then he could go across the border into the United States and the Mexican soldiers would stop. Now, eventually, the commanders, the theater commanders there on the American side and on the Mexican side, they got together. They said, well, look, if you're chasing him, you can come across our border. If we're chasing him, we're going to go across your border. But one of the reasons that Geronimo didn't want to wind up in Mexico is that Geronimo held a personal grudge. He actually had been waging a personal vendetta against Mexico and all things Mexican because when he was a relatively young man, he was fairly recently married. He had a couple of kids, and there was a truce, at least he thought there was a truce, between his band of Apaches who were residing in Mexico at that time and the Mexican government. But so one day he went off hunting and he comes back and he discovers that the camp where he had left his wife and children and the other warriors had left their wives and children, the Mexican troops had come out and they'd slaughtered all of them. And Geronimo vowed from that time forward, he would essentially kill every Mexican he could lay hands on as soon as he had the opportunity to do so. And so Mexico was not a place where Geronimo was going to find any kind of refuge from the United States, if only because he would start killing people in Mexico when he got there in a response to their killing, as he saw it, their killing his family. Mr. Brands, after writing this book, whom do you come to appreciate more as a leader, Sherman or Geronimo? I will say this, I don't measure either one against the other. I will say that Sherman's strengths were his ability to understand the nature of war and to pursue his campaign to its logical end. And in this regard, Sherman went to school on this in the Civil War. And Sherman, in fact, I raced fairly quickly through the biographies of Sherman and Geronimo until 1865. But I need to set up how they're going to live their lives after that. I need to make sensible what they do. And in Sherman's case, Sherman had been a professional soldier. He went to West Point and he fought in the war against Mexico. Actually, he didn't fight. He was in the war against Mexico. He was in California. And then he left the army in the 1850s, as very many people did, because he couldn't support a family. He couldn't make a living. But then he came back when the Civil War began. And it was during the Civil War that he understood finally what the nature of war was. And this gets back to what I was saying earlier. Wars end when the losers decide we give up. It's not the winners in charge. It's not the winners who are making the decision. It's the losers who are making the decision. And Sherman concluded the way you do this during the Civil War is you make it clear to the other side that the war is going to be painful. And if they continue to resist, then they are going to suffer increasing damage. This was the point of Sherman's march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah, is march through Georgia, where he carved this swath of destruction across Georgia. He needed to bring home to the people of the Confederacy the costs of the war. Until this time, for most Southern civilians, the war had simply been what their soldiers did. And Confederate soldiers were just as capable as Union soldiers. They were outnumbered, but they're holding their own. But what Sherman wanted to demonstrate was that if you keep this up, then the life that you know is going to end. In fact, he ordered the evacuation of Atlanta. And the town fathers, the city fathers of Atlanta came up to him and said, this is going to be harsh. This is going to be painful for the women and children, for the old folks who have to leave their homes. And Sherman said, that's the point. The whole point is for it to be painful. If war weren't painful, you'd keep fighting this forever. So Sherman understood that the vulnerability of the Confederacy was its civilians. Not that Sherman's soldiers slaughtered civilians. They did not. But they made clear that if you continue to fight, your civilians will suffer. Their standard of living will decline. They might go hungry at times because we're going to seize all of their crops. And this is exactly the approach that Sherman applied to in the Indian Wars. As I say, in terms of battles fought, it was a toss-up between the US troops and the Indian troops, the Indian warriors. Where the Indians had to give in finally was they had to support, protect their women and children. And Sherman and Phil Sheridan, who was his right-hand man for part of this, they decided to wage campaigns during the winter. In Indian warfare was a fairly genteel sort of thing, and they always took winters off. But Sheridan and Sherman concluded that if we fight them during the winter, then they will really feel the cost of continued resistance, because they will not be able to stay down in their lodges. They'll have to move out of their teepees. They'll be floundering around through the snow. They'll have a hard time eating. And that's exactly what happened. And leader after leader, chief after chief finally said, my women and children are dying. We have no alternative. So Sherman understood that's the way you do it. For Geronimo, in the case of Geronimo, the thing about Geronimo, you have to give him credit for his stubbornness, for his adaptability, for his mastery of tactical warfare of the kind that he fought. And so some of the soldiers that I write about, in fact, who convey some of the story, one of them was John Burke, who became an enormous admirer of the Apaches for their ability to live off the land in a way that US soldiers could not. US soldiers had a long supply line that always followed them, but the Indians, the Apaches in particular, could live off the land. They could blend into the land. When they were attacked, when they were cornered, they wouldn't fight to the end. They would all split up. They would scatter in a dozen different directions. They always had agreed that, okay, 3 days from now, we will regather at this place that's 90 miles from here. And they could cover that much ground on foot in just a matter of a few days. They could go faster on foot than the soldiers could go on horseback. And so for anybody who is chasing Geronimo and his followers, this could not help but evoke admiration. It's remarkable that they could do this sort of thing. And time after time, the soldiers, they respected the Indians as fellow soldiers, as fellow combatants. They understood that these people are as good as anybody we've got. And Geronimo certainly was at the head of that list. Let's see, do we have time for a couple more questions? Omar, how are we going on time?
We have a couple minutes, so we can handle a question or two.
Yeah, okay, let me take a couple more questions here. Sherman loved the South. He was first president of what became LSU, and he warned them it would be terrible before he left at the start of the war. I think it's an exaggeration to say that Sherman loved the South. He had friends in the South, and he did, in fact. He headed up the military academy that would become LSU, but he also warned people in Louisiana, including the governor of Louisiana, very clearly that if you secede, you are unleashing a whirlwind that you have no idea of, because many Southerners, including those Louisianans that he was talking to, imagined that those Yankees simply wouldn't fight. And Sherman said, you don't know them. They will fight and they will destroy you. And he never thought for a moment that he would be anything but loyal to the Union. He admired some of his fellow soldiers, and when he died, there were some surviving Confederate officers who were his pallbearers. And so there was this sense of soldier to soldier, officer to officer. There was this continuing respect that transcended what they considered the politics of it. Sherman was someone who absolutely despised politics. He could have had the presidency of the United States for asking in the 1880s after Grant left office, but he didn't want to have anything to do with it. And he hated the time he had to spend in Washington. And when he commanded the Army of the West, and even when he commanded the overall army, he made his office in St. Louis rather than in Washington, because he always thought that the politicians had some ulterior motive. And this despite the fact that his brother, John Sherman, was a senator, and a distinguished senator from Ohio. So that's Sherman. Let's see. Had Lincoln expressed a vision or plan for the settling of the West and the treatment of Native Americans had he lived? No, he had not. He had his hands full dealing with the South and dealing with slavery. In terms of getting beyond that, no, he didn't. But I will say this, that Ulysses Grant did. And Ulysses Grant, who in many ways considered himself the heir of Lincoln on a lot of issues, it was Grant who actually came up with a comprehensive reservation policy, sometimes called a peace policy, sometimes called the Quaker policy, because one of the things that this policy entailed was firing the Indian agents who answered to the War Department and were notoriously corrupt, and replacing them with missionary types, Quakers, but also Protestants and Catholics and so on, because they presumably were more honest and had the best interests of the Indian peoples at heart. But it was Grant who wanted to end the constant fighting. The whole business of reservations, it was a real haphazard hit and miss affair before the Civil War. But when Grant became president, this is what we're going to do. We are going to reserve these lands for the Indians. And at the time, there were some people who said, no, we're going to take all the Indian land. So granting the Indians reservations was a lot less land than the Indians had controlled, had occupied before this, but it was a lot more than some other people in the United States wanted them to have. And so it was considered a rather enlightened policy at the time. Even Indian reformers like Wendell Phillips, who was a bête noire of Sherman, thought this is a pretty good deal. And it included, for example, the Sioux Reservation, the Lakota Reservation in the Black Hills. But the problem that Grant ran up against, the problem that this peace reservation policy ran up against, was it was unpopular in Congress, and it was unpopular with the American people, at least with the American people for whom Indian policy was a big deal. And here it's worth recalling that this last phase of the Indian Wars coincides with the emergence, the blossoming of American democracy, where ordinary people can make their wishes felt and get Congress to move on them. Sherman one time described how this was going to work. He was traveling in eastern Colorado, and he encountered a farmer in particular who had made a lot of money during the Civil War provisioning the U.S. Army. And the Civil War was over and he had lost the Army contracts, but he was just itching for a campaign against the Indians. And the reason for this was, it's not that he had anything against the Indians, but he wanted those contracts to provide the U.S. Army again. And the only way to do it was to get an Indian war. So Grant understood that the settlers, the people living on the frontier, had motives of their own that didn't coincide with the interests of the United States as a whole. But nonetheless, he was going to probably have to deal with the consequences of the fact that those settlers had the ears of their legislators in Congress, and Congress would pass laws that would insist, for example, that the Black Hills be open to prospecting for gold. And so Sherman, I'll just close on this note, Sherman was the commanding general on the victorious side, but throughout this all, he was extremely ambivalent about the whole enterprise. He thought that there was very shady dealing on the part of the US government at times. He thought that, for example, the US simply ought to give Arizona back to the Apaches and give it back to Geronimo and tell all the settlers there, get out of here, because it wasn't worth much to the whites. It was worth a lot more to the Indians than it was to the whites. And all it was going to do is cause more wars, more battles, and more bloodshed. Congress wasn't listening, and it didn't happen. But that's sort of the attitude that Sherman had on all of this. Well, anyway, so this has been great. Thank you all for paying attention. Omar and Mark Twain House, thanks for hosting, and good night to everybody.
Thank you so much, HW. And thanks for everyone for joining us. If you joined us late or want to go back and rewatch the program, you can do so on our YouTube channel. I dropped a link in the chat. And I'll be uploading this recording tomorrow morning. You can also check out our events page to see all our upcoming programs. There's a link in the chat for that as well, and you can go to our website to see that. And finally, in about 2 weeks, we're going to have Museum Store Sunday on Sunday, November 27th. We'll have discounts at our store, free snacks, drinks, and activities, festive music, dramatic readings with historic interpreters, and of course, holiday tours of the house. So come and experience the holidays with us at the Mark Twain House and Museum. That's all for this evening. Thanks again, HW. Thanks again, audience. Have a great evening.